In the past few days, Europe has been shaken by an extraordinary leak. Germany's Der Spiegel reported that, during a December 1st phone call with European and Ukrainian leaders, French President Emmanuel Macron warned that the United States might betray Ukraine on core territorial issues. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz echoed the concern, urging President Volodymyr Zelensky to be especially careful as Washington pushes ahead with its own ceasefire talks that many in Europe now fear are happening without them. Finland's President Alexander Stubb also voiced distrust toward the U.S. envoys leading negotiations, while NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stressed the need to protect Zelensky amid the diplomatic scramble. At the same time, inside NATO's December 3rd foreign ministers' meeting in Brussels, European anxiety grew even sharper after U.S. Secretary of State Rubio skipped the session, just as U.S. Russia channels appeared to be accelerating. With Washington's 28-point peace plan facing criticism for mirroring Russia's territorial demands, European governments are doubling down on military support, preparing for the possibility that current peace efforts could fail. In this analysis, we'll unpack why Europe's trust in the U.S. is fracturing at such a critical moment, and what this rift could mean for the battlefield, for diplomacy, and for Ukraine's future. The December 1st phone call between European leaders and President Volodymyr Zelensky marked a turning point in how Europe views the direction of the Ukraine war, and more importantly, how it views the United States under the current diplomatic dynamic. According to Der Spiegel, President Emmanuel Macron's warning that the U.S. might betray Ukraine on territorial issues was not a spontaneous remark, but the expression of a deeper fear that has been building in European capitals for months. His frustration, as reported, centered on Washington's refusal to clearly define what security guarantees Ukraine would receive after a ceasefire. For Europe, this omission isn't a small detail, it's the core of the entire conflict. Without guarantees, any pause in fighting risks becoming a trap that locks Ukraine into permanent territorial loss and leaves the continent exposed to a future Russian offensive. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz echoed these concerns even more bluntly. His warning to Zelensky, "They are playing games with you and with us," reflects Berlin's belief that negotiations led by U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner could be skewed toward rapid concessions. Europe has observed for decades that Moscow excels at exploiting divisions among Western allies, and a U.S.-Russia channel operating with minimal European input is precisely the scenario the Kremlin favors. Finland's President Alexander Stubb added his own skepticism, urging that Zelensky and Ukrainian officials should not meet American envoys alone. His hesitation is rooted in Finland's long historical experience dealing with Russian negotiation tactics. Talks dominated by great powers tend to produce outcomes that smaller states must simply accept, whether they benefit or not. Even NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte reportedly felt compelled to intervene, emphasizing that we must protect Volodymyr. This is a revealing statement, not because Zelensky is personally at risk, but because NATO leaders believe Ukraine's political leadership could become isolated at the negotiating table if Washington prioritizes speed over strategy. The fear is not that the U.S. seeks Ukraine's collapse, but that American domestic political pressures, particularly the desire of President Donald Trump to deliver a quick diplomatic win, could lead Washington to accept territorial compromises that Europe finds unacceptable. This mistrust intensified further when U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio skipped the December 3rd NATO foreign ministers' meeting in Brussels. European officials publicly downplayed the absence, but privately it raised alarms. At a moment when the U.S. and Russia are accelerating their direct diplomatic contacts, Europeans expected Washington to reaffirm transatlantic unity. Instead, Rubio's absence reinforced the perception that the U.S. is treating peace talks as a bilateral U.S.-Russia project, with Europe simply reacting to updates instead of shaping the process. European anxiety is also driven by the contents of Washington's 28-point peace proposal, leaked in late November. Critics note the framework mirrors several Russian demands too closely, particularly regarding contested territories in eastern Ukraine. Britain, France, and Germany responded by drafting a revised plan, blending Washington's outline with European priorities, most importantly, rejecting the idea of granting Russia de facto sovereignty over regions it has not fully conquered. Vladimir Putin swiftly rejected this European revision, confirming to many in Europe that Moscow sees the U.S. proposal as more advantageous and views European involvement as a threat. All of this places Zelensky in an extremely difficult position. While Ukraine relies heavily on U.S. military assistance, Kyiv also understands that its long-term security is tied to Europe. European countries share a border with Russia, the U.S. does not. European governments cannot afford a frozen conflict that leaves Russian troops entrenched a few hundred kilometers from Warsaw, Vilnius, or Bucharest. That is why NATO's European members used the December 3 meeting to expand contributions to the Pearl framework, Norway adding $500 million, Germany and Canada adding $200 million each. These are not symbolic gestures, they signal Europe's preparation for a scenario where peace talks collapse and Ukraine must strengthen its position on the battlefield before any durable negotiation is possible. Politically, the divisions highlight a fundamental difference in strategic culture. The U.S. often treats conflicts as problems to be concluded, Europe treats them as realities to be managed over generations. For Washington, a ceasefire could be the end of a diplomatic process. For Europe, it would only be the beginning of a long-term security architecture that must prevent Russia from repeating its aggression. This difference in mindset is now producing real friction, and in my view, it is likely to intensify rather than fade. Europe has entered a phase where it no longer assumes Washington's interests naturally align with its own, especially under a U.S. administration focused on rapid, optics-driven achievements rather than slow, coalition-based diplomacy. Still, Europe is not preparing to break with the U.S. Rather, it is preparing for the possibility that it must play a much more assertive role, militarily and politically, than it has in decades. The December phone call, the NATO meeting, and the growing list of European financial commitments all signal the same message: Europe has woken up to the risks of being sidelined. And for the first time since the start of the war, European leaders are speaking out openly about their fears, instead of whispering them behind closed doors. The widening gap between European leaders and Washington is not simply a diplomatic disagreement, it has the potential to reshape NATO's strategic posture and influence the trajectory of the war itself. The December 1 phone call, combined with the December 3 NATO foreign ministers meeting, revealed a structural tension that has been building since early 2023. Europe wants a durable peace based on deterrence and territorial integrity, while the United States, under the current diplomatic leadership, appears increasingly focused on achieving a quick, high-profile ceasefire that can be framed as a political victory. If these approaches continue to diverge, the consequences could ripple far beyond Ukraine. A major point of contention is the U.S. insistence on pressing ahead with bilateral U.S.-Russia talks. From Washington's perspective, direct channels reduce complexity and avoid the slow, consensus-driven process of involving every NATO member. But to Europe, this looks dangerously similar to the great power politics of the 20th century, where smaller states were pressured to accept compromises negotiated over their heads. The alarm expressed by Finland's President Alexander Stubb, urging that Zelensky not meet U.S. envoys alone, reflects a deeper historical memory in Northern and Eastern Europe. When Russia negotiates with powerful states, it aims to extract concessions from those who are not in the room. This fear is amplified by the broader geopolitical context. Vladimir Putin has made it clear that his ambitions in Ukraine are not limited to the Donbass or to the regions he currently occupies. He sees the war as a historic project to reverse what he believes was Russia's strategic humiliation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. From that perspective, a U.S.-brokered ceasefire that freezes current lines would merely confirm Russia's gains and grant Moscow years to rebuild militarily. That is why many European diplomats privately say they fear a Korean-style armistice more than continued war. An unstable frozen conflict on Europe's border is, to them, a recipe for long-term insecurity. NATO officials understand this risk as well. While NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte publicly expressed support for U.S.-led efforts, his leaked comment, "We must protect Volodymyr," reveals an awareness that Zelensky could be cornered into accepting a deal unfavorable to Ukraine's long-term survival. At the December 3 NATO meeting, this awareness prompted a coordinated effort to increase military contributions to Ukraine through the Pearl mechanism, with over two-thirds of NATO members now pledging funds. Norway's $500 million, Germany's $200 million, and Canada's $200 million reflect a shifting mindset. Europe is preparing for both scenarios: a flawed peace deal or the collapse of negotiations entirely. But the political implications extend even further. If the U.S. continues to dominate peace talks at the expense of European input, NATO could face its most serious internal fractures since the Iraq War in 2003. Unlike past disputes, this one involves immediate national security risks for Europe. Countries like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia view Ukraine as a defensive buffer. Any deal that legitimizes Russian territorial gain signals to them that NATO's security guarantees may not be as absolute as they believed. In this sense, Macron and Merz's warnings are not merely criticisms of U.S. diplomacy. They are preemptive efforts to maintain European unity at a time when Washington's strategic calculus seems to be shifting. From my perspective, the real danger is not that the U.S. and Europe will split, but that a subtle misalignment will harden into a lasting structural divide. A United States that sees European conflicts as negotiable and Europe that sees them as existential. If that happens, NATO's ability to deter future aggression, not only from Russia but potentially from other revisionist states, will be weakened. The alliance's power has always come from unity, not just military strength. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the consequences of diplomatic uncertainty are already becoming visible. Ukraine cannot plan long-term operations without knowing whether Western supplies will remain consistent. Russia, sensing ambiguity in Western strategy, has increased pressure on all fronts, from drone attacks to attempts to seize full control of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Kremlin clearly believes time is on its side, especially if Washington is eager for a deal and Europe is divided. If the U.S. Russia talks produce a framework that Russia views as advantageous, Moscow will stall, manipulate, and demand more, knowing Western leaders are desperate to announce progress. That is why several European nations are now openly preparing for peace talks to fail. They recognize that only battlefield leverage can compel Russia to negotiate seriously. Europe's urgency reflects a hard-earned lesson from modern history: peace agreements signed from a position of weakness rarely hold. Looking ahead, the outcome of this diplomatic tug-of-war will shape Europe's security architecture for decades. If Europe steps up militarily and diplomatically, NATO could emerge stronger, more balanced, and more unified, no longer relying disproportionately on Washington. If not, the continent risks entering a new era of strategic uncertainty, where its fate is determined by deals struck between the world's great powers.